Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
And let's get that.
Go. Okay, so we did the sociological approach to Frankenstein.
So the sociological approach is the connection between human nature and society as a whole. Okay. So I'm gonna put like a base down. So the first, I was serious. Okay. So women had many obligations and few choices. They had a little bit more than like their predecessors. Obviously, they had a little bit more education, but they still were not allowed to go to college. But they had fewer children. There was a movement toward gender equality, which you saw in Mary Shelley's mom's work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. But they were still kind of like secondary to their husbands or fathers, whoever was in charge. The familial roles, servants didn't really have to live in the house, they weren't crucial anymore, which you saw in the humanization of Justine. She was more of a person instead of just like someone that was there. And the role for hospitals goes into science. Hospitals were a bigger thing. When someone died, they could dissect them. And so better medicine, better understanding of the human body, and widely accepted experimentation. That meant that there were like more laboratories. Oh, I said that. There were laboratories, and people kept scientific journals so that you could follow every step that they took, even though Frankenstein said he wasn't going to do that because he never wanted someone to make his mistake.
Okay, so for the women's roles, just to base this, we kind of talked about it in the last slide, but like Mary Shelley's mother was a leader in kind of like the whole like feminism. She had a really strong influence with feminism and all that, so Shelley grew up kind of with this influence on her life, and it definitely affected her writing. So during this time, women were kind of looked at as inferior and weak. And in the novel, they didn't have a lot of major roles, or any really. The women, but like women were like the main support to the men, even though they didn't have, what is it called? They didn't narrate any of their own parts. So like all the narration was done by men. So we only got to see the women's perspectives through the perspectives of a man. So women didn't really have any freedoms, and a good example of that is Elizabeth. She kind of represented passiveness in the novel because she kind of had to wait for Victor to give like attention to her, and then she was a possession to Victor, and there's a really good quote to show that where. Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't find the quote. Okay, so the quote is, "All praises bestowed on her, I received as made to possession of my own." So Victor was like taking credit for anything that Elizabeth would kind of like accomplish, kind of saying that like he owns her in a way. And I just kind of summarized that the women's roles in the novel were that Mary Shelley might have been trying to say Mary Shelley might have been trying to reflect the situation of women during that time, and they were trying to show how women were important to men. They were like their support, even though they didn't have any like leading roles. So Shelley just kind of tried to summarize the time period and show how women were kind of represented.
So I'm going to talk about the family ties of Frankenstein, or really like the lack thereof. So the first quote is, "The innocent, helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up good and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties toward me." So Frankenstein is talking about his childhood and suggests that parents have, that parents have like a huge role in in their children's lives and guarantee their happiness or misery. This kind of showed that Frankenstein didn't consider the monster to be his child like a lot of readers consider him to be. And he, like many soon-to-be parents, sought to create life without actually thinking about its consequences and its effects on other people. And then my second quote is that no human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence, who felt that they were not the tyrants to rule our lot according to their price, but the agents and creators of the many delights which we enjoyed. While I mingled with other families, I distinctly discerned how peculiarly fortunate my lot was, and gratitude assisted the development of filial love. I said that this was ironic that Victor grew up in such a loving and kind environment, and didn't do that at all to his creation. And that the effect of family ties is also evident in the woodshed scene when he is watching the Lacey family, and kind of, that's where he learns about the humanistic ways of life. And
Okay, so for the education of women, there's basically two different representations in the novel. There's the representation of how most women actually were educated, which would have been Elizabeth, where there was a very strong lack of formal education. She wasn't stupid, but she never went to college or anything like that. And whereas the sort of, I guess, if a woman was educated, they had to be educated much like the creature did, where they had to self-educate themselves by observing their surroundings and other people. So as the creature learned by watching, you know, the people in the little hut and watching how they educated the foreign girl, women had to watch the men and overhear their conversations, listen to things like that, and that's how they educated themselves because they weren't really given the opportunities for a formal education. And so, for my quote, the world was to me a secret which I desired to discover. To her it was a vacancy, which she sought to people with imaginations of her own. And that was from Victor. And basically it describes the difference between men and women's education. The men got they got a book education, and so they saw things like that, whereas women had to make up their own education just by looking around. So she, you know, Elizabeth's education was imaginations, but they're still true. She was just observing things because she didn't get the chance to go and study like he did. And so for the contrast between education, so you have Justine and Elizabeth versus Safie and the creature. So those are the two representations of women's education and how they kind of contrast each other. So the women who aren't very educated are very weak and submissive, and they both end up dead. Whereas the other two, well, the creature's not actually a woman, but because his education parallels that of what women could have been, it's included, and they are stronger and more independent. And so Justine and Elizabeth murders is actually kind of symbolic of how educated women can undermine and overthrow the social status of women, and that's sort of, it's also like demonize the creature, and that's a way of demonizing how educated women could completely change the social climate of the time and why they're kind of scary to men because they wanted to keep women submissive, and if they're educated, that will be a lot harder to do.